I'd like to offer a warm welcome to everyone here to the beautiful campus of Coral Ridge Presbyterian Church, and which is also the home of Knox Theological Seminary. And I'm delighted to have you all here this morning for the symposium that we have been anticipating for some time, entitled The Past and Future of Christianity and Science. We're happy to have you here. My name is Scotty Maynor. I serve as the president of Knox Seminary and associate professor of historical theology. And if this is perhaps for some of you the first encounter that you've had with Knox, and so just by way of a quick introduction, we're a seminary in the tradition of the Reformation that exists to train men and women to declare and demonstrate the gospel of Jesus Christ. Our goal is to train those men and women who feel a sense of calling in any capacity of life, and that could be in full-time vocational ministry, full-time teachers. We have pastors, plumbers, lawyers, doctors, you name it, but they all recognize the sense that God has called them to be gospel bearers in the context in which they serve. As any student of history would actually know, and this is one of the areas that I love to teach, and of course if you were to attend Knox you would grow in, and you look at the culture that we are wanting to influence with the gospel of Jesus Christ, and you look through the annals of time, you would realize that there's ever-changing conversations within culture and religion, but typically there's one constant, and that is, how do members of a religious community, how do Christians understand the relationship between a God who has revealed himself in Scripture and that same God who has revealed himself through his creation? It's exciting to be part of that dialogue that has been going on for centuries. And we're thankful especially to the Science for Seminaries grant, which Knox received last year, and this is part of that progress that we are making through this grant season. And that was put on funded by the John Templeton Foundation and administered by the American Association for the Advancement of Science and the Dialogue of Science, Ethics, and Religion, in consultation with the Association of Theological Schools. I want to thank all of them, and especially their staff, for the warm welcome that they have given the Knox community to be part of this progress, to be part of a larger conversation, and for coming up with the idea in the first place, recognizing that institutions of higher learning, theological institutions that are training ministers in order to minister well to a world around us ought to be equipped to engage in a conversation meaningfully with such a big area as science and the issues that are coming out of that today and the exciting new technologies, new discoveries that are happening, some of which we will be covering today. I want to thank those who are participating today, those speakers who will be part of various panels. I want to thank the staff of Knox Seminary, especially Tim Sansbury has been at the core of so much of this. I want to recognize him and just say he's done an immense amount of work, and a deep debt of gratitude goes to him for making this possible, for the church, of course, for letting us use this chapel this morning. The purpose of this symposium is to ask a familiar question in a new way. I've already hinted at it. That is, how does a God who's revealed himself, chosen to reveal himself consistently through both Scripture and through the creation that is his, how do those two things relate to one another? The first sentence of Scripture begins to answer that question for us, as does the rest of Scripture. And the conversation throughout history continues to have that sense of wanting to understand more clearly how we as members of this world and also members of a community of faith understand the integration of the ways that God has revealed himself. And so it's important and imperative that we learn from our past. And so we're delighted to have Dr. Ted Davis here to kind of take us on a bit of a whistle-stop tour over the eras that have preceded us up to the present time. And if you were to Google science symposiums at seminaries, you would recognize that most symposiums tend to stop right there. They tend to focus on where have we been and then how does that apply right now. And that's important, and those are important conversations to have, of course, for today's pastoral concerns. But I mentioned we're asking the familiar question in a new way. And that is, rather than stopping right now, we're looking at our past, learning from that, and then also engaging the future, peering into what is coming our way from various scientific areas of study, and being able to anticipate what are the big questions and conversations that Christianity is going to have to engage with and wrestle with. And so we begin first by looking at our past, and we begin then by looking at the future and what's coming. And so for some of you, there may be a sense of surprise that I'm not arming you. We will not be arming you with great arguments to win today's battle over hot topics in science and Christianity. No doubt that what we learn today will find immediate applicability. But the primary focus is really beginning to think through how do we as Christians live faithfully and anticipate well that which is coming. And so the goal is to equip us with categories, with processes for thinking through as Christians, come what may, we are prepared well in order to engage in that dialogue with society, with the world around us. A quick word about the program going forward. We're going to begin with Dr. Tim Sansbury, who's going to introduce us to the way we go about forming those categories well. And then that will shift on to the history of science and Christianity, a quick lesson there, and then we'll have a coffee break. After that, you'll notice that in the program, there's a series of pairs, each discussing various topics going forward. We're going to begin with different scientific experts introducing us to the frontiers of a scientific area that is of interest, that is of importance, and that we ought to be thinking about now. And then, of course, there will be a theological response. Our attention first turns to the area of genome editing. You may recall Dolly the sheep in 1996. That has nothing, and that doesn't even register compared to the sort of scientific technologies that are available today or that are coming our way, and including looking at how is it even possible to look at the human genome and see areas where, you know what, maybe if we could just edit these little strands, that would make that person healthier or better or somehow have a more preferable life. That's a big question, and we're delighted to have Dr. Lindsay Bruce, whose PhD is in integrative biology and is a teacher across the street at Westminster Academy. She's going to be walking us through that area, and the respondent will be her husband, Dr. Josh Bruce, who will be giving a theological perspective. Husband and wife engaging in a public conversation about two polarizing areas. What could possibly go wrong? Next, our attention will turn to the frontiers of the world of neuroscience. We're delighted to have Dr. Lucina Uden, PhD in cognitive neuroscience from UCLA, works at the University of Miami by way of Stanford here, and we're going to be looking at the question of consciousness and at the very core of who we are and what we think about ourselves and the degree to which science can actually explain a significant part of that. And how do we as Christians think through that in light of God's statements about who we are as image bearers of Him? The respondent there theologically will be Tim Sansbury. And finally, our third area will be looking at the world around us. Ecological concerns. How do we as Christians who have been called to steward God's creation well do so? And we're delighted to have Dr. Tom Chesness, PhD in environmental engineering sciences from Palm Beach Atlantic here to guide us on that journey. He's already actually guided the faculty on a journey earlier this year. We had a retreat down into the Everglades, and I saw firsthand something I never recognized before, which is how important and big this topic is. And so we're delighted to have him here, and in response, we have Dr. Larry Trotter, who's a Knox adjunct faculty member and pastor of Florida Coast Church, here to give that response. As we explore these lines of inquiry, we do so with confidence and knowledge, knowing that God is consistent in who He is, and He's consistent in the way that He has revealed Himself, both in terms of general revelation, the world around us, and special revelation in terms of Scripture. And yet, there's a tendency to divide the two. There's a tendency, on the one hand, to have science claim authority over the world of the phenomena around us, the ability to explain that in ways that don't require theological concerns at all. And on the other hand, there's this tendency for theologians to claim that we don't really need to engage meaningfully in conversations about the world around us because we have God's special revelation to us in Scripture, and that's sufficient. That's all we need. And that's a scary thing, because what we're doing is we are divorcing the world in which God has created and said, "This is mine." And the heavens and the earth declare His majesty. And we somehow retreat into potentially just looking at His special revelation through His Word. And I'll speak personally, that was a hallmark of my own upbringing. I've been educated in Christian schools my entire life, for the most part. And even having gone to a Christian college and a Christian seminary, I am remarkably ill-equipped to engage meaningfully in conversations about how my faith matters and engages well in the world of science. That is not okay. And we at Knox recognize that's not okay. This is one of a series of first steps towards addressing this important avenue of bringing back together an understanding of who God is in light of the multiple ways, the two major ways in which He has chosen to reveal Himself. And so I'm as excited as you are for me to stop talking and get the show on the road, because I'm here to learn along with you. And so with that, I'd like to invite my friend and colleague, Dr. Tim Sansbury, up to begin these series of talks. Thank you.
Well, good morning, and thank you for that welcome. I understand we still have some audio issues on the live stream, so if I'm looking back, are we all the way up on? That's great. So for the students that are coming in from a distance, we want to welcome you as well, now that you can finally hear us. Hopefully you're still here, as well as everyone that's come out this morning. For those at a distance, we understand that this is part of what you're trying to do for school, and so we are glad to be able to have it up for you and ready to go. So as we get started, I'm going to be on the stage a few times, which you'll be able to determine whether that excites you or not here in a few minutes. Two of those talks are the responses and the kind of really fun looking forward stuff. This one is a little bit different than that. This one is more designed to give us some categories of thinking. Now, if you've ever paid attention to academics when they make up categories, the first person to really come out with a set gets a lot of credit, and then a lot of other people get published by telling them all the ways that they're wrong. And that will be true of what I'm going through right now. So I'm going to be talking through, generally speaking, some categories of how science and religion meet that come from a fellow named Ian Barber. And Ian Barber was one of the first people to really set this out at a popular level. He influenced a lot of people, even though theologically, when you get to what he likes the best, most evangelicals, and all of them that are paying attention, would be troubled by what he ends up with. But his categories are still helpful. They're helpful for us today because as we go through them, I want you to pay attention to them as they come out in ways that they may fit the way you think on a day-to-day basis, the way you expect things to go in this science and theology or science and Christianity conversation, but also the ways in which it almost makes you think in a particular way and keeps you from being able to engage well either on the science or on the side of religion. So the categories, one of the critiques is they mix things together, and you're going to see that. I'll try to bring it out, but they're helpful to see as a starting point. Now, I'll be doing them out of order, so if you're familiar with his book, you won't hear them the way that they go because I like a different one the best than he does, and this is my talk, not his. The first one that I want to talk about today is a model that he calls independence. Now, independence is, at the basic level, independence is the idea that theology or religion talks about a completely different kind of thing than science does. They just are having different conversations. And there's some truth to it. We could see a picture of that. So imagine someone who has just had their house burned down, and they're standing in the front yard, and they're saying, "Why did this happen?" Now, if we were to come in with a good chemistry answer and start looking for heats of activization and talk about the way in which, well, you had this little bit of energy that came in the front end, and then there's wood inside of your house, and so then that allowed the overall energy to drop and decline, and really that wood would rather be carbon dioxide and water, and that's why. No. They're not asking how it burned down. They're asking why, for what reason, to what end, for what purpose. There are ways in which science and religion answer different questions. Morality is one of those areas where ultimately, while science can be helpful in talking about morality, when the questions, the right questions and the right issues to ask about have been given to it by an external, whether philosophical or religious system, on its own, science is insufficient to be the establishment of morality. But that's not enough, because when this is really taken to the extreme, what it ultimately does is it says, if I'm religious, I don't care about what science says. And if I'm scientific, I don't care about what religion says. And that was part of one of the initial ways in which this was brought out. That was part of the goal, was let's just stop having these fights. You do your thing, and I'll do my thing. In the church, we actually bring this up at times, not at the level of intentional theory, but we bring it up at the level of accidental way of life. In the church, we talk about people who seem to see Christianity as a Sunday thing and have that utterly and completely separated from what happens at least Monday through Friday, if not Saturday as well. So it can be a lived way as well as an intentional and thoughtful way. But ultimately, it cannot be enough. While it's true there are some areas in which science and theology do not overlap, some areas like morality where they can help each other but can't conflict with each other, there are also areas where very directly Christianity is making claims that enter into the scientific world. Paul, when addressing the Corinthians about the resurrection, is very clear. If the resurrection did not actually happen, then this is all worthless and a waste. And he didn't say it like some foolish, crazy, superstitious person who thought resurrections were fairly straightforward. He said it like you would expect him to say it, as someone who understood. This is a crazy claim. Resurrections don't happen. It's not like in the Greek world they were used to them, so no one was surprised, but now we know better. That's why he says, go talk to this guy. Go talk to that guy. Go talk to those 500 people. Go talk to the people who saw it happen. There are points of overlap which we need to recognize, which essentially Paul was saying, and if it didn't happen, then understand this isn't true. Christianity makes claims that overlap with reality in ways that prevent us from doing this just complete separation. Independence doesn't work. Now, the next model is one that Barber calls integration. And if you read Barber, this is the one that he likes the best. The physicist John Polkinghorne gave a series of lectures when I was in my seminary studies, and I was able to listen to him. And in talking through this, he said, I actually renamed this assimilation rather than integration. But instead, to kind of help, I'm going to use a more technical term and call this the smushing model. The smushing model. Integration is a nice word. Assimilation is a little bit more of gives you a little more of a rhetorical sense of what the problem is, and smushing tells you really what's happening. It's when we just say, look, one or the other, either religion or science, gets to tell us what the truth is. And we can pull words, we can pull concepts, we can pull ideas from the other to have the scraps and leftovers or the places where they fit, but there's really only one of these. In my experience, thoughtfully done, this most often happens on the side of science and trying to create whether to say a religious-y science or a science-y religion, I don't know which way to go. But it's on the side of the science basically dictating this is what the concepts of reality are and getting to lay religious names over the top of those. So what God is limited by what we've seen about the way the world works. Process theology, which is what Ian Barber favored, is when he gets done with it, initially, I should say, it's not a very Christian kind of theology. But Barber manages to bring a bunch of Christian words and lay them into process theology, which you don't need to know about, in a way that makes it sound much more like it's Christian than it really is when you get down to what it means. That's why Polkinghorne said what he has done is he has assimilated the religion from the side of science. Now, we can certainly do that from the side of Christianity as well, but more often when there is the frustration with the content of science, we get into the model that's called the conflict model. The conflict model is probably one that you're most familiar with. You're probably most familiar with it because of several, as some of us that were in class heard over the last couple of days, there are several absolutely false histories of science and religion which say that's always the way it works. And they're just demonstrably false. That the ways in which theology, and Christian theology in particular, and scientific endeavors have been linked together is remarkable and complex. But the conflict model comes popularly just from this idea that that's the way it's always been. But it also comes from what we often experience. We often experience this sense of conflict. People on the science side, the reason this grant exists is because the scientific community finally was pushing the endeavor to have seminaries do a better job because they were feeling like we're constantly fighting this battle with religion and we don't want to. Please equip people better. Now, their goals in that may not be the same as ours, but they're responding to this idea of conflict. One of the biggest problems with the conflict model is it's not actually something somebody would believe. In terms of the idea that Christianity or theology has truths in it, and science has truths in it, and that those truths are incompatible, there aren't very many people who will say those sorts of things, and actually the ones who do usually end up in the kind of independence model. If you really mean truth, it's hard to mean truth combats with truth. If you're naturally thinking in this combat model, this conflict model, it's probably because you have some expectations in mind regarding either religion or science. From the science side, likely, if you think science and religion are in conflict, likely, it's either because you're overextending what science can actually say, or in your mind, religion is really something that's in the little narrows of ignorance that we have, where we don't yet understand the world, and that the more science grows, the more religion shrinks because of the way that just what knowledge is, because of seeing something like science and religion as being the same sort of thing, but now science is taking over as religion fades. Probably from the science side, if you're starting from conflict, it's that, or it's a category of believing that religion is religious people, and by religious people meaning a few loud voices. Now, that last one will be our hook to go into the next side. On the side of Christianity, if you feel like science and Christianity are in conflict, it is probably because you're doing something similar. You are probably either seeing science using the word science, but meaning scientists, and by scientists, pointing to some particular representatives, especially those who claim to be representatives of the whole thing, like Richard Dawkins. And if Richard Dawkins is science, then science and religion are in conflict. So one of the ways you may feel the conflict is there is because by the word science, you mean something different than what science is. You mean scientists. It's also possible that you mean conflict because by the word science, you mean a broadened worldview. Something that science does methodologically is go into the laboratory and assume that things are going to happen in regular ways, the way it happened yesterday is the way it'll happen tomorrow, and not only regular, but by means of natural causes. This is entirely consistent with Christianity, which understands natural causes to be God's ordination for how the world will work. It's entirely consistent. Part of what makes miracles miraculous is that they're weird. They have to be weird to be miraculous, and to be weird is to say that they're extraordinary. But there are people who extend that methodological practice of naturalism into a worldview. Rather than saying, I will act as if there are no miracles or there are no supernatural events, to use a word that's not perfect, there cannot be any of those. Actually, one of the great skeptics in philosophical history, a guy named David Hume, who was no friend to the Christian religion, is also one of the best guys to have undermined the idea that you could possibly, by any number of appearances of the same thing happening over and over again, discover that miracles can't happen. Science cannot say that miracles can't happen. That is not a possibility within the scope of what it does. But there are people who will act as if it does, and there are times that it can feel as if it does. And that's also because, as Christians, at times, we can have these gaps where we say, God is working there. And as science starts to explain that gap, we feel our world shrinking. And rather than relying on the underlying theology of sovereignty that says, whoa, this is all God's, we feel our faith being shrunk, and we react. The conflict model cannot be sustained as a real picture of how the world works. It only works as a mistake or a psychology or a sociological theory. The last model, though, is one that he names dialogue. And it's the one that really explains what we're doing here. So Barber, I said, prefers integration. What we will be doing here is dialogue. Dialogue recognizes that while it's impossible to completely separate religion and science, and while it can't possibly be that they're always in conflict if they're actually expressing truth, and while it's not enough to just smush them together, there are still things that happen that are surprising. One of the things that you'll, I think, be surprised by in the next talk is going to be hearing from Galileo this rich description of the authority and inspiration of Scripture. I think you'll be shocked. One of the things that will be a minor point, though, will be seeing how much he sounds like John Calvin when he does that. And I'll draw your attention to something in Calvin that's really interesting. If you go to John Calvin's commentary on Genesis, and you're going to see a little bit about it here, you're going to hear about it shortly, and I'm going to reference it again in the end. Calvin references this really interesting conflict that was apparently going on in the church. And the reason it's so interesting to me is because I had never heard about it. I didn't know that it was a conflict. I've never felt this sense of, about what was happening with Scripture. I haven't even today, I'm not really able to touch it as a way that feels bad, and yet it's so consistent with the way apparent conflict really does happen in the church. So here's what had happened. Scripture, you may remember in Genesis 1, talks about the creation of the sun and the moon and the stars. And in that description of the creation of the sun and the moon and the stars are described as lesser lights, and the sun and the moon are described as greater lights. Now, for me, looking outside and going and viewing the sky, that fits. Saturn and the planets are smaller than the moon. Now, in my head, because I've been getting it through elementary school, it also doesn't bother me that I know that Saturn is actually quite a bit larger than the moon. It doesn't bother me a bit. But if you were to take yourself back to a time period in which it's actually surprising, I think, to find that at the time of the Reformation, astronomers had been able to show, by means of some remarkable studies that they did without the kinds of tools we have today, that Saturn was bigger than the moon. And right away, put yourself in the position of somebody who gets told by scientists, Saturn is bigger than the moon. I find my students don't have much sympathy for the people who were upset by this. But think about it. Scripture says lesser lights and greater lights, and the moon is a greater light. And going outside says lesser lights and greater lights, and the moon is a greater light. And to presume that what Scripture is doing there is not just describing what I see, but affirming how it is very natural. And frankly, if somebody walked in and said, you see that little point of light? It's actually really big. It's bigger than the earth. They knew the earth was round. They knew about how big the earth was. That's really big. Is it really true that the first thing you would think is, oh, okay, I've been reading this wrong? In the moment, that would feel like conflict. The feeling of conflict is not the problem. The question is, what do we do? And that's why what we're doing here is anticipating the future, because what we should do is let a conversation happen. And by the way, some of those conversations will take a long time. Let a conversation happen. The first moment you hear somebody say, that little tiny point of light, it's bigger than the moon, you say, no way. But then, if you look at it and the evidence is really strong, then what could you do but appropriately go back into Scripture and say, is this possible in that Scripture? Now, you can't even feel it now, if you're like most of my students. That you would even be worried you can't feel it. But Calvin is answering to people who are obviously angry with him and the scientists and saying, look, as you'll see, look, God was talking to people who didn't know this. He was accommodating his language to what they thought. The dialogue doesn't mean you immediately then get over it. You might feel uncomfortable your whole entire life if you've been reading it one way. But what dialogue says is that when something new comes in that you weren't expecting and you don't know how to handle, stop and think. Go back and look. Now, maybe you would go back into Scripture and you would say, I just can't change this. And you would go back over because science does not always come to us correct. It does not always come to us correctly interpreted. And it does not always come to us correct and lacking an overall worldview that isn't actually in the science. The dialogue produces time for us to try answers out. Some of those answers will be wrong, and one of the things we need to allow is a place for people to try answers without being immediately condemned when they aren't the right ones. The first answers will usually be wrong because we haven't had time to puzzle things out together, and we'll talk about that at the end as well. Dialogue is what we're aiming to do today. We're going to look at a past event in more depth. We are going to anticipate some future events on purpose because we need to get ready for the ways in which these will be a challenge. You'll see starting points from respondents who said pretty uniformly, I don't know how to do that, and to whom we said, that's the point. As we prepare students, we want you to see how the process works. We want you to understand that the process isn't finished and that even people with fancy degrees getting confronted with ideas that live in their own home don't always know what to do with them. We don't know, and we also don't know exactly how it will play out. But we do know that truth does not conflict with truth. We believe this truth is true of Christianity. We believe that Christ was really resurrected. And so we engage in a process of interacting with what we learn from his world and what we read in his word, understanding that it's been 2,000 years and it'll continue for a while as well. So with that, I'd like to introduce our next speaker. Ted Davis is somebody that I've gotten to know through the course of this grant. We were introduced at the beginning. Ted is coming in from Messiah, as you heard before. And Ted is going to be talking about one of these times when conflict came up. It's probably one you've oversimplified on two sides of things. You've probably oversimplified Galileo as just a scientist, and you've probably oversimplified the objections as just Roman Catholics and Aristotle. And I hope that what you'll hear is something that is much richer and shockingly similar. It was to me when I first saw the real text, to the way that we would approach this very kind of issue today.